Hi class, this chapter that we're going to discuss today is chapter 12, Stress and Health. It's such an important chapter because it really has so many practical applications to it as far as our daily life is concerned. So it starts out just defining what stress is. Stress, or kind of give an example of it, stress occurs when an emotionally evocative situation overwhelms a person's perceived ability to meet the demands of that situation. So it's our perception of being able to cope with what's occurring at the moment. As with emotions, continually evaluated over and over again to determine whether or not is it a stressful situation or not. I'm just going to look over my notes here, guys. Stressors are events that push us to the limits. It can be a divorce. It could be something. Could be a loss of a job. It could be an increase in work increase of work at your job that can cause stress. The variables on what causes stress are just innumerable. There is a social readjustment scale, rating scale. Holmes and Ray put it together that people often look at to see where they are at. Those are the ones that says, if you have a death in the family, you get so many points, and there's so many points you add up to determine whether or not how stressed you are. Some people don't realize how stressed they are. Let's see. First thing is appraisal. First encounter situation or environment. We'll quickly appraise what it means to us. Two kinds of appraisal. There's primary appraisal, assessment of what the situation means to us. Outcome of the appraisal determine whether an emotional response might occur. And then there's the process. We assess the resources available to cope with the stress. And in a process, so we know what the stresses are, but what resources do we have? That's the secondary appraisal. That's over my notes. Thanks for being patient, guys. This is, to me, the physiology of stress is interesting. There's an HPA pathway called the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal gland. It's this pathway that connects together that releases cortisol. Cortisol it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. You should have this optimal level of cortisol in your body. It's a neurotransmitter. It helps us to motivate us to move and do things, so that's a good thing. But it can also be a little bit of a challenge for some individuals when there is too much stress. Let me just fix my camera a little bit there. One thing that we do know is that as stress increases and continues, if you have a continual exposure to stress, you have increased levels of cortisol. Eventually, the text doesn't really talk about this that much, it eventually comes to a place where your body the cortisol just gives up. And so, in fact, we'll just say, for an example, we'll just say, hypothetically, we'll just use this as an example, we'll say you should have a cortisol levels between 10 and 20. But if you have cortisol levels of 30, you're super stressed. So what happens if your body experiences that high levels of cortisol for so long, the HPA pathway gives up. And you're going to actually experience cortisol levels down at like 0 to 5, which you think, well, that should be good. But in fact, that means your hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland system, that HPA pathway, has given up. That is not good. You want it to be between 10 and 20. Hypothetically, I'm using those numbers there. Let's see what else we've got here. Cortisol. There is the General Adaptation Syndrome, gas syndrome by Hans Seil. He proposed a 3-stage model explaining changes in physiology that occur. The 3 stages are alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. Those are the 3 stages associated with the gas model. Alarm mobilizes the body's resources to act. Resistance is a reaction to that. And then exhaustion is just when your body overwhelms you. Let's see what else we've got here, guys. Thanks for being patient. Again, when we look at this balance in our body, that gas, that gas model, we're looking for homeostasis. And the model is based off of a person not having stress or just having minimal amount of stress. That's what it's based off of. That cortisol has a profound effect too. Increased levels of cortisol affects our hippocampus, which deals with our long-term memory formation. That's why you'll see individuals that are under stress having trouble making decisions. That's what's occurring there. It's based off of that associate levels of cortisol. Coping strategies. Text talks about problem-focused coping. That aims to change the situation that's creating the stress. Motion-focused coping strategies regulate the experience of the distress. This is kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy, which we'll talk about in a few chapters from now. Traumatic disclosure, discussing a stressful event, relieves oneself from emotional burden. There's actually been some debate about that, to be honest with you. When 911 occurred and there was a lot of people that went out there to help, what they found is that they were doing brief counseling with them to help them with the stressful environment. And for some individuals, it wasn't stressful until they started talking about it. And so that created more of a problem. And so there is a little bit of debate about there whether or not it should be invoked, for lack of a better term. Social support can be very positive. There's a lot of strengths to it, but then there's also some negatives. What we find is that some individuals that are involved in some social support are maybe more prone to obesity and ruminating over the stressful event. Positive psychology of coping. They look at optimists and pessimists. Optimists view things as always being great, wonderful, and they have a tendency to do better in stressful situations, and pessimists are more likely to succumb to the stressors of the event. Finding meaning, they say perhaps a key to psychological health is to find meaning in what has occurred. After an event occurs, some traumatic event occurs nationally, our churches are filled with people. And they're searching for meaning. Why did this occur? And so finding meaning in a negative thing, a difficult thing, is so important and so helpful for individuals as they deal with stressors. It can be helpful for individuals that I've worked with that have had long-term stressors, genetic disorders that have affected their lives forever, or health problems that have suddenly taken away their vitality. Finding meaning in what's occurring is really, really helpful for them. And the text kind of substantiates that. The way we deal with stress, too, affects the telomeres. Telomeres are end segments of DNA. And in fact, one could say, without being killed by rampaging chihuahuas or something like that, you could predict how many days when you're going to die. The telomeres are end segments, and they replicate over and over, or they reduce themselves over and over again. And we can predict how long it's going to take for them to end, and that's typically when life will end for you, aside from a traumatic event that has occurred. And what we know is that individuals that are pessimists are more likely to have lower segments of that DNA, the telomeres, on them, suggesting that they have a shorter lifespan. Just suggesting. Don't take that to heart. I want you to think that you're going to die early if you're a pessimist out there. Just some research that was out there. Two major ways of explaining the relationship between stress and illness. They are not mutually exclusive. We know that stress can reduce your immune system, making you more susceptible to illnesses. Can increase. They've done studies on individuals, too, personality types, looking at type A, type B behavior. You've heard of that before, type A being driven and everything else. And they suspected, there was one study that they suspected they would die earlier, and 21 years later they did follow up, and lo and behold, they were alive. And so they thought, well, that's interesting, but some of them were dead. And what was it that separated these type A's from each other? And there's one component, that's hostility. Those individuals that have hostility as a part of their type A driven behavior are more likely to die early than the other ones, than type 8s without that behavior. Let's see, what else we want to talk about here? Just going over my notes, guys. Thanks for being patient with me. Depression certainly is another factor associated with stress. Increased severity of symptoms and increased risk of death from coronary disease. We see that as well. Just glancing over, guys. Here we go. Things that are not going to help, with that people will often gravitate towards during stressful situations that are not helpful, of course, is smoking, alcohol, eating can be a problem. Certainly, it's not a solution to your stressful situations. So obesity can occur. When we're under stress, we're more likely to eat. You see that. Things that moderate that, of course, is exercise, meditation. And that pretty much finishes up this chapter, guys. Hopefully it's been helpful, just kind of an introduction to the chapter. It is, again, a chapter that's very practical. It's one thing that I do like about it. It's got some real practical advice on how to manage stress. Stress is a factor of our life, certainly here in America. And this gives some real practical strategies to manage those stressors. Hope this helps a little bit, guys. Thank you so much for your patience, and we'll see you in the next chapter.